The other thought and theories on aging is that transposons get disrupted, leading to genomic instability. There's also some thoughts that the methylation of protein around the DNA and the DNA itself becomes altered. While this has been true in most cases in studies, it's not clear that those changes in the DNA actually affect relevant genes for everyday metabolism and functionality. That a lot of these changes occur in what we call inert or non-transcriptionally active DNA. A recent theory proposed by Dr. Horowitz is that there's an epigenetic clock in that basically that there is DNA methylation that increases with increasing time, and that you can predict somebody's age based upon this methylation clock. and so this has gained a lot of attention. But again, this relates to this whole question of what impact does it have on transcriptomes and transcriptional activity that would be important for the aging process, and that has not yet been established. Another important theory is called era catastrophe. This is where there are damages to protein that include cross-linkage. So diabetes, for example, is actually is a good example of what are called age-generated end products, or another name for the person who discovered them, Amadori products. And these are covalent cross-linkages between glucose and the and peptides, and so you get this cross-linking events that cause protein aggregates, and in some cases people believe that it causes what we call proteotoxicity. So these aggregates of protein actually become toxic to the cells. An additional theory we had mentioned is immunosenescence. Typically the T cell, memory cells in particular, accumulate, as you would expect with aging, and the naive T cell subset starts to decline. Those naive T cells are less able to be activated under circumstances of infections. Sometimes they get dysregulated and cause autoimmune type reactions. Most of the aging immune system is within the T cell branch, although more recently research has shown that there are some defects in the B cell progenitor cells, and that macrophages and monocytes are also defective, and there is new emerging evidence that these monocytes and neutrophils migrate to inflamed tissue and send out inflammatory signals that are sustained. And so while the overall impression is that the immune system is slow to get activated in older adults, that once it is activated, it may produce a cytokine storm that is perhaps not reversible. And more recently with the pandemic with COVID, the cytokine storm is one of the indicators of bad outcomes, and the older adults are the ones that are succumbing to the pneumonitis more so than younger individuals, and one of the mechanisms may be the cytokine storm. So the aging process can be viewed as a functional impairment over time. This is one of the goals that we're trying to achieve, is to keep everybody 100% highly functional. And you can see that in an average population, that functionality over that population declines as they reach their life expectancy. Some people, such as diabetics, maybe alcoholics, maybe substance abusers, will have an accelerated loss of function. Conversely, people who are successful agers, if you will have a slower onset and amount of functional disability. And so basically we want to move the curve here from red to blue. I mean, that's one of our goals. And certainly through behavioral and lifestyle interventions, try to move this green curve over to the red curve. Mentioned that organs age at different rates, and so their manifestations as we see the older adult are as displayed here. We know that kidney and heart function are the most susceptible to age-related processes. Other things such as physiologic changes in body temperature really don't occur so much, and so if you see somebody with a lower basal body temperature, let's say 96 Fahrenheit, you might want to consider that in the context of hypothyroidism or other reasons for a lower resting body temperature, as opposed to blaming it on age per se. So here we'd like to go from organ to organ tour of what aging does to the organs. And so with the aging eye, we know that there's increased iris rigidity. The pupil may be sluggish in dilating and accommodating, and so this actually becomes a problem with light to dark adaptation, where people, after they see a bright light in the older adult population, may have temporary blindness for a longer period of time than the younger population. Of course, there's cataracts that occur with increasing age, sometimes accelerated by certain occupations such as sailors and fishermen who have the reflected UV light off the water that accelerates cataract formation. There's syneresis, which occurs because of the vitreous contracts, and basically those are floaters that we talk about, little spots that we see floating across the eye. And you'll see less of a foveal, that so-called red light reflex as people get older. With glaucoma, you can see on the retinal exam the increased cup to disc ratio and the so-called nasalization of blood vessels. And you can see here that there's visual impairment of basically peripheral vision is reduced substantially. There's also senile macular degeneration, and there's the so-called wet exudative senile macular degeneration versus the dry, which is more prevalent. And you can see, again, central vision becomes blurred with people with senile macular degeneration. There are auditory changes with age, and so you can see that with increasing age that there at least up to half of the population has hearing impairment. this occurs insidiously, and so people don't always recognize that they're having hearing loss, and sometimes they'll blame their spouse for not speaking clearly enough or loudly enough, mumbling. Those may all be indicators that the individual is having reduced hearing. The prototypical audiometrogram is shown here on the left. So this represents presbycusis, which is the loss of hearing at high frequencies. And so you can see in the upper part of the graph, this x-axis here is that 4,000 to 8,000 hertz requires very, very loud conveyance of those frequencies for people to hear them. Sometimes the hearing impairment is compounded by cerumen impaction, and so I think it's absolutely mandatory with each clinical encounter that the older adult have their ears examined, both in terms of hearing test as well as for cerumen impaction. So as mentioned, presbycusis is the result of bilateral high-frequency hearing loss. As mentioned, it's insidious, and it's recognized when the hearing acuity dips below 8,000 hertz. Sometimes it is associated with ringing in the ears, tinnitus, and there is a gender difference where men experience more hearing loss than women. And you should also consider hypothyroidism as one of the reasons why hearing loss might occur in the older adult population. There are consequences for presbycusis. As mentioned earlier, there's deterioration in communication. Sometimes people feel more isolated. Family members and friends may consider the person senile as a result of hearing loss. All this leading to increased depressive symptoms, sometimes even paranoia, they're talking about me, and then further functional impairment related to this withdrawal from social activity. In terms of the aging mouth, I want to highly emphasize, as seen in the slide, dry mouth can be accompanied with dry eyes, but the impact of this is not so much with aging, but rather with medications that reduce salivary flow. Typically, these are anticholinergic medications, which are generally a no-no in the older adult population. So a prototypical medication that's commonly used is Benadryl, diphenhydramine. This medication is highly drying and anticholinergic and can cause confusional states in older adults, as well as this general phenomenon of drying the mucosal membranes. I want to briefly touch upon neurologic and cognitive changes with aging, covering the central nervous system through the peripheral nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. So cerebral blood perfusion generally declines with increasing age. We haven't quite put together the functional consequence of that. So low perfusion does not always necessarily mean less brain function, but suffice it to say that there are studies that are looking at both function of the brain as well as brain volume, particularly hippocampal volume, as a proxy measure for Alzheimer's dementia. And so progressive loss of hippocampal volume has been linked to Alzheimer's disease. And interestingly, some research shows that individuals on a Mediterranean diet, particularly those supplemented with fish, have a lower rate of hippocampal shrinkage over a 5-year period than when compared to people that are on a more diverse omnivore type diet. So there's some subtle changes with memory and aging. These are typically called tip of the tongue word searches. People trying think of a particular word and just can't recall it. This can be seen with aging, but for the most part, the acquisition of memory is a little bit slower with aging, but it is not defective. In terms of reflex, this is a study that was done by John Disterhoff many years ago, and it shows basically a Pavlovian conditioned response where he took a eye blink, a puff of air in the eye, and coupled it with a ding sound, and eventually got rid of the puff, and people still blinked with the sound over a period of time. But as you can see, that blinking started to extinguish after so many repetitions, and so one of the rate of extinction was at a certain rate for younger people and was fairly quick, whereas it took longer for the older people to extinguish that reflex. There was an interesting study from Finland where they compared older adults with young adults, trying to memorize their mini golf score, so a little bit of physical activity with memorization. And so the young and old had equal abilities to remember their scores without auditory distraction, but once there was some loud music interjected, I think they were playing the Rolling Stones, and it turns out that the older people had less memory retention as a result of that distraction. This is some research that I collaborated on, and basically what it shows that in the right graph here, the loss of sympathetic tone over time with elderly. This is a cross-sectional study, but you can see there's a steady decline in the sympathetic tone, whereas the parasympathetic tone in a cross-sectional study appears to have a U-shaped curve, where folks that are older, 85 and older, tend to have a parasympathetic footprint, if you will, similar to those that are in their 40s and 50s. The relevance of this is not clear. It's not clear really whether these individuals with high parasympathetic tone started off with high parasympathetic tone when they were younger, or whether they just sustained it or actually improved it through different measures. You might say, well, what kind of measures could they take? Those would be physical activity, mindfulness, and so certainly meditation, for example, improves parasympathetic tone. So the other observation that was implied by those graphs is that heart rate variability decreases with age. And if it goes down to, so those are beat-to-beat variations. There are several studies that show that with more than one standard deviation compared to your age-matched control, that low heart rate variability is actually a predictor of mortality. So you have a twofold mortality rate with low heart rate variability. So again, things that can enhance heart rate variability are those things that help slow the heart rate down overall. So a slower heart rate has more variation. Things like physical activity will slow the heart rate down. So that seems to have the most impressive impact on trying to reduce heart rate, trying to improve heart rate variability.